Hey everyone. Tonight we'll delve into the most unsettling question in all of Norse mythology. What if Odin's famous sacrifice wasn't a tea about gaining knowledge, but about burying a terrible truth? Imagine you're standing on the precipice of a cosmic event, not a single hero's journey, but an echo that reverberates through time. Shaking the foundations of reality itself. We think we know the story. Odin, the Allfather, sacrifices one of his eyes into Mimir's well, to gain cosmic wisdom. But what if that eye, an orb of raw, unfiltered vision, wasn't a payment for wisdom, but the seal on a secret so vast and so terrifying that it could shatter the cosmos? You probably won't want to believe what you are about to hear. So, before the tension gets too high, take a moment to like the episode and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now, close your eyes, imagine the ancient mountains, and let's unravel this epic tale together. The silence that follows a great act of sacrifice is never true silence. It's a vacuum filled with the hum of unseen consequences. You stand on the edge of the Well of the sacred spring from which the Norns draw the threads of fate. The air here doesn't smell of earth and water, but of possibility and loss. You can almost feel the absence of Odin's eye, a void where a universe of sight once existed. The first and most mainstream version of this ancient myth paints a picture of a wise king seeking to protect his people. He willingly gives up a part of himself for the greater good. This is a common trope in stories across all cultures, from the one-eyed Cyclops of Greek mythology to the many heroes who have lost something essential for a noble cause. But Odin's sacrifice wasn't a noble act in the traditional sense. It was an act of brutal psychological triage. He didn't just lose an eye. He actively tore a piece of his divine self from his being and threw it away. Think of what that eye truly was. It wasn't just a physical organ. It was a conduit, a lens. The Norse believed the world was not just seen but created by perception. This eye, Odin's right eye, was the part of him that saw not what was but what could be. It was the eye of ambition, of conquest, of a certain kind of brutal foresight. A quirky detail of Norse legend often overlooked is that Odin had to consume the mead of poetry to gain his knowledge, but this was a separate quest. The eye was something else entirely. It was his will made manifest. When he submerged it, he didn't just give up sight, gave up a part of his nature. He became less ambitious, but more calculating, less a warrior, more a king. But the question that remained was, what would the universe do with such a potent artifact? What happens when a god's will, a piece of his divine consciousness, is cast into the cosmic depths? The waters of Mimir's well didn't just absorb it, they reacted. The surface of the water, previously as placid as a mirror, began to boil, to churn. And from that chaos, something new emerged. It wasn't the wisdom Odin sought. It was a reflection of the knowledge he didn't want, the secrets of his own undoing. And the well in its infinite wisdom didn't just grant him a new way of seeing, it gave him a new burden, the terrible, creeping certainty that his own downfall was not a distant event, but a story that had already begun. The myth tells us he gained knowledge, but the truth is, he gained a prophecy so terrifying he had to tear it from his own being. And that, my friends, is where our story truly begins. The journey to Mimir's well was never a simple walk. It was a pilgrimage, a descent not just into a chasm, but into the very subconscious of the world. Imagine the crunch of ancient rock under your feet, the air growing colder with every step, the distant, thrumming sound of the well itself less like water and more like a heartbeat. The mythology is clear. This was a place of immense power, guarded by Mimir, the wisest of all beings. But the story of Odin's sacrifice is often told as a simple transaction. An eye for a drink from the well. The untold truth is that the deal was far more complicated, the stakes infinitely higher. The well, we are told, held all the cosmic wisdom, the memories of creation, and the fate of all things. It's a concept found in countless cultures, from the Oracle of Delphi in ancient Greece, where prophetic wisdom was drawn from the earth, to the Celtic belief in sacred wells as gateways to other worlds. Mimir, the guardian, wasn't just a keeper of knowledge. He was its physical embodiment. A quirky yet terrifying detail often omitted is that Mimir was not a full-bodied being, but just a head, a living head that spoke and gave counsel. This suggests a form of knowledge so vast and so old that it couldn't be contained within a single body. When Odin approached this disembodied head, he wasn't just asking for a drink, he was seeking a specific, terrible truth. He knew a prophecy had been whispered on the winds, a prediction of his own death and the downfall of his world. Ash! He wanted to know the details, to see the face of his destiny. The deal, as Mimir explained it, was not about wisdom at all. It was about balance. For every piece of knowledge, a part of the self must be offered in return. For the deepest, most unsettling truth, the price was a piece of him that was equally profound. And so, Odin offered his eye, the eye that saw the future, the eye of ambition and conquest. He offered it not to gain wisdom, but to see what he would do to avoid his fate. He sought a path away from Ragnarok, and to find it, he needed to see the precise nature of the events that would lead to his end. The eye was not a payment for wisdom. It was a bargaining chip for a specific piece of information, a secret so profound it could undo everything. But the question that remained was, what was that secret? What could possibly be so terrifying that Odin would pay such a price, not for power, but for a single, chilling glimpse of a different future? The truth is, the deal was never about knowledge. It was about a hidden pact, an unspoken agreement to look away from a certain path, to pretend that a specific event, a terrible moment of betrayal he saw in the well's depths, never happened. The myth of the eye is a red herring. It's a great story to tell, a beautiful, tragic tale of sacrifice. The real story, the one that's been forgotten, is the one about what Odin agreed not to see. And in that pact, in that single act of selective blindness, he set in motion the very events he was trying to avoid. As he turned from the well, his mind filled with the knowledge of his impending doom, a different kind of dread began to creep in. Certainty that the real threat wasn't in the future he had seen, but in the truth he had just buried. The contract between Odin and Mimir was not a simple barter. It was a metaphysical negotiation, a dangerous cosmic game of chess. The traditional narrative presents it as a straightforward exchange. Odin gives an eye, Mimir gives wisdom. You can feel the air around the well itself, thick with the weight of unstated conditions, fine print written in the very fabric of existence. Odin didn't just give an eye. He gave away a part of his soul, a part of his divine essence that was linked to a specific and terrifying fate. And in return, Mimir gave him not just wisdom, but a terrible choice. The secret was not about Ragnarok itself, but about the catalyst. The well showed Odin a vision of his own downfall. Not at the hands of a great beast or a mighty warrior, but through the betrayal of someone he trusted implicitly. Someone whose loyalty was an unspoken rule of their relationship. The price for this vision wasn't just his eye, it was his silence about what he saw. A peculiar parallel can be found in a historical fact about the Delphic oracle. In ancient Greece, the priestesses who delivered prophecies often did so in riddles. It was considered a sacrilege to ask for a direct, simple answer, because to know a future too clearly was to seal its fate. In a strange way, Odin's sacrifice was his way of accepting a riddle. He paid a price to see a truth he was forbidden to speak aloud. The bizarre detail about this is that the deal was for Odin's second eye, his right eye, the one that saw the future to be given to another being, to Mimir. The pact was that Mimir would show him the truth. But Odin had to give his eye to someone who could use its power to alter the very future he just saw. The recipient was a lesser-known deity, a shadowy figure who existed on the fringes of Asgard. In giving his eye, Odin was also giving a piece of his foresight, his will, to this other being. He was, in effect, outsourcing his fate. But the question that remained was, who was this other being? In what terrible prophecy did Odin see that was so terrifying he was willing to lose a part of his sight and his will to a third party to stop it? The answer is more chilling than any monster or giant. He saw the end of the gods not through fire and ice, but through a slow, quiet, psychological decay. A creeping poison that would rot Asgard from the inside out. He saw a great hero, a champion of the gods, being turned against them not by force, but by a single, carefully placed lie. And in his desperation, Odin gave his eye to the only one who could use its power to manipulate this hero and thus prevent the prophecy. He gave it to Loki. He believed he was preventing a catastrophe, but what he was doing was setting a match to a powder keg. By making a deal with the god of lies, he created a deeper, more insidious threat. The sacrifice wasn't a noble act of gaining wisdom. It was a desperate gamble, a pact with the very entity that would eventually be his undoing. As he turned away from Mimir's well, his one eye saw a future he believed he had averted. But his other missing eye was already a tool in the hands of the god who would orchestrate his downfall. And in that moment, the fate of the cosmos was sealed, not with a clash of swords, but with a silent secret understanding between two of its most powerful gods. Gungnir, Odin's spear, is a weapon of legend. Forged by the dwarves, it is said to never miss its target and to always return to Odin's hand. But like all powerful mythological artifacts, its story is more complex than it first appears. It's not just a weapon. It is an extension of Odin himself, a physical manifestation of his will and his authority. The myths claim it was forged from the wood of Yggdrasil, the great world tree, and imbued with powerful runes. This mainstream belief is a beautiful one, a story of cosmic power made manifest. But what if its true power was far more sinister and directly tied to the fate of Odin's second eye? A lesser-known historical fact is that in ancient Germanic societies, the spear was not just a tool for war, but a symbol of a ruler's right to command. A chieftain's spear could be used to consecrate land or to cast a sacred lot, giving it a religious significance beyond its practical use. Gungnir, in this context, wasn't a weapon of war, but a tool of cosmic law. It was a spear of fate. The quirky, bizarre detail is that Gungnir was said to sing when it was thrown. It didn't just fly through the air. It hummed with a resonance that could be felt in the deepest parts of the earth. But this wasn't a song of triumph. It was a low, mournful, and unending hum. This hum, it turns out, was the echo of Odin's lost eye. When the eye was given to Loki, it didn't just sit in the trickster's hand, a passive tool. It began to see and to transmit that vision back to Odin, not through his empty socket, but through his most trusted weapon. The deal Odin made was not only to give his eye away, but to allow Loki to use its sight to watch and influence the great hero Odin had seen in his vision. In return, the spear, Gungnir, would become the conduit for that information. So every time Gungnir returned to Odin's hand, it brought with it a torrent of images, whispers, and distorted truths from Loki, who was now acting as a hidden scout in the cosmos. But the question that remained was, what kind of information was Loki sending? It wasn't the pure, unfiltered vision of the future that the eye once provided. It was a twisted version, filtered through Loki's own chaotic and malevolent mind. The beautiful cosmic vision that Odin had sacrificed his eye to see became a funhouse mirror of reality. Loki showed Odin a world where the heroes were falling, where the gods were turning on each other, and where the prophecy was coming true, not in spite of Loki's actions, but because of them. Odin, blinded in one eye, and seeing a distorted reality through the echo of his weapon, began to make terrible decisions. He saw betrayal where there was none, and acted on information that was a lie wrapped in the thinnest veneer of truth. He believed he was averting Ragnarok, but he was actually becoming a puppet, his every move a reaction to a phantom threat. He had made a pact with the god of lies, and now he was paying the ultimate price, the truth itself. The hum of Gungnir was not the song of a glorious weapon. It was the whisper of a god slowly going mad, listening to the echoes of a truth he had given away. To see is to know, but to see everything is to bear an unbearable burden. This is the truth that Odin began to learn, not by gaining knowledge, but by having it weaponized against him. The traditional tale says Odin became the wisest of all beings, a king whose foresight was unmatched. But what he really gained was a terrifying psychological burden, a constant nagging fear that everything he saw was a lie. You can feel the weight of this as if it were a physical pressure on your shoulders, a cold dread that seeps into your bones. The whispers of Gungnir, the echoes of his lost eye had begun to poison his mind. A curious parallel can be drawn to the psychological concept of hypervigilance. In our world, people who have experienced trauma can become hyper-aware of their surroundings, seeing threats and danger where none exist. They are constantly on guard, their minds creating scenarios of attack and betrayal that are not real. This is what was happening to the Allfather. He had seen a single, terrifying truth in Mimir's well, and now, with the constant stream of twisted information from Loki's use of the eye, he was in a state of perpetual psychological warfare. He was fighting a war against a ghost, and the ghost was his own missing sight. The quirky detail here is that the eye, now in Loki's possession, was not just showing him events. It was showing him the emotions of those involved. It was a bizarre kind of psychic feedback loop. Loki could see the raw, unfiltered emotions of the great hero from Odin's vision, and he could use the eye's power to manipulate those feelings, sending a twisted version of them back to Odin. Odin would see the hero's doubt and fear, but it would be amplified and distorted, appearing as open hostility and a desire for treason. It was a masterclass in psychological manipulation, a perfect, silent coup. But the question that remained was, why was Loki doing this? It wasn't just to see Odin suffer. The trickster's agenda was far more complex and far more sinister. He was sowing seeds of doubt, not just in Odin's mind, but in the very foundation of Asgard. By making Odin paranoid and suspicious, Loki was creating rifts between the gods. He was turning them against one another, making them see traitors in their midst, where there were only loyal allies. He was using the power of Odin's own foresight against him, making him destroy the very bonds he was trying to protect. And in the shadows of this psychological war, a new threat was rising. The giants of Jotunheim, ever a cunning and patient foe, began to notice the subtle changes in the Allfather. They saw his paranoia, his rash decisions, his increasing isolation. They began to receive their own omens and prophecies, not of a great war, but of a quiet internal collapse. Odin had gone to Mimir's well to see his doom, but in his attempt to avert it, he had created a new, more insidious path to ruin. He was becoming a shadow of his former self, a king ruled not by wisdom but by a phantom limb of vision. And the entire cosmos was beginning to feel the chilling, silent change. Jotunheim, the land of the giants, is not the barren wasteland of ice and rock it's often depicted to be. It is a land of deep, psychological cunning, where a different kind of power thrives. The giants, sworn enemies of the gods, have a patient, almost geological sense of time. They do not just wait for Ragnarok. They watch for the subtle cracks in the divine facade, and they noticed Odin's change. You can almost hear their whispers carried on the wind nod of a coming war, but of a quiet internal collapse. The giants, for all their brute strength, were masters of a different kind of magic, the magic of observation and subtle manipulation. A historical fact about early Scandinavian tribes is that they often employed psychological warfare, using rumors and false prophecies to weaken their enemies from within before a single sword was drawn. The Jotun's approach was no different. The quirky detail is that they didn't use spells or weapons. They used mirrors. They had a series of scrying pools connected to each other across the frozen landscape. And in these pools, they could see reflections of what was happening in Asgard. But these reflections weren't just images. They were amplified emotions. They could feel the fear and suspicion that Odin was projecting, and it was a feast for them. The giants had no need for a massive army. They knew that if the head of the serpent was rotten, the body would soon follow. They began to use their own unique brand of magic to send false omens and unsettling dreams to the gods of Asgard. They didn't lie. They simply showed the gods what they were already beginning to believe. They showed Thor's strength as a weakness, a sign of his reliance on brute force rather than wit. They showed Freya's love for her brother as a suspicious attachment that could be exploited. They took the fear and paranoia that Odin, through Loki, was spreading, and they turned it back on the gods themselves, creating a perfect feedback loop of distrust. But the question that remained was, how were they able to see this? Loki's manipulation was subtle, a whisper in the ear of the Allfather. Ah! The answer lies in the deep cosmic connection between the eye and its well. When Odin casts his eye into Mimir's well, a tiny, almost imperceptible fraction of its power resonated throughout the cosmos. The giants, with their ancient understanding of cosmic currents and ley lines, were able to tap into this faint hum. They weren't seeing what Loki was showing Odin. They were seeing the effect of it. They were seeing the psychological ripple effect of a god slowly going mad with suspicion. This was the true danger of Odin's deal. He had not only given away a piece of his divine self, he had broadcast his weakness across the 9 realms. The giants didn't need to win a war. They just needed to wait for the gods to destroy themselves. They were not the brutes of legend. They were the puppeteers, pulling the strings of doubt and paranoia that Odin, in his fear, had unknowingly handed to them. And in the silence of their icy kingdom, they smiled, because they knew that the end of the world would not come with a bang, but with the quiet sound of a god losing his mind. In the great hall of Asgard, amidst the roaring fires and the clanging of tankards, a quiet treachery was taking root. It was not the kind of treachery that announced itself with a flourish of swords or a shouted challenge. This was a slow-burning poison, a kind of psychological warfare that was almost undetectable. The mainstream Norse legends are full of grand betrayals, Loki's role in Baldur's death, for example, but the most dangerous betrayals are the ones that happen in plain sight, with a smile and a promise. And one such betrayal was beginning to unfold, fueled by the paranoia of the Allfather. A lesser-known historical fact is that in many ancient courts, the greatest threats were not from outside invaders, but from inside factions vying for power. The court of the gods was no different. Odin's increasing suspicion, fueled by the distorted images from his lost eye, began to fall on a lesser-known deity, a god of quiet crafts and subtle magic. This god, whose name has been largely forgotten, was a master of illusions. A quirky detail of his character was that he had a collection of bizarre artifacts, trinkets from forgotten realms that were not powerful in a traditional sense, but could be used to amplify and manipulate emotions. He had a set of chimes that, when they rang, could make a room of gods feel a fleeting sense of despair. In a single, polished stone that could make a fleeting thought of suspicion grow into a full-blown accusation. Odin, increasingly isolated and paranoid, began to rely on this deity for counsel. He saw in the god's quiet demeanor a certain kind of honesty, a contrast to the perceived boisterous arrogance of his other allies. But this was a trap. Loki, using the power of Odin's eye, had shown Odin a twisted version of the great hero's actions. The hero, in his strength and loyalty, was seen as a threat. The god of quiet crafts, however, was shown as a loyal confidant, a safe haven from the perceived treachery. Odin, a ruler who once commanded with supreme confidence, was now making decisions based on a lie, a whisper of a rumor that was not even his own. But the question that remained was, what was the god of quiet crafts getting in return for his quiet treason? It wasn't power, not in the traditional sense. It was something far more valuable to a being who craved influence over raw strength. He was getting the ear of the Allfather, a position from which he could shape the future of Asgard. He was not just an informant, he was a silent puppeteer, using his strange artifacts and his quiet manner to deepen the rifts that Loki had created. He wasn't the master of the conspiracy, but he was a willing accomplice. It's a secondary player who would benefit greatly from the chaos that was to come. And in the heart of Asgard, a place of feasting and glory, a subtle rot was beginning to set in. The gods were so focused on the external threats and the grand sagas of war that they completely missed the quiet, psychological war being waged right under their very noses. Deep beneath the waves, a silent and ancient power was stirring. Jormungandr, the Midgard serpent, was not a mere beast of destruction. He was a creature of immense knowledge, of a kind that predates the gods themselves. He was born of Loki's union with the giantess Angrboda, and like his siblings, he was a being of fate, tied inextricably to the final battle. Mainstream mythology paints him as a symbol of cosmic chaos, a monstrous force that will one day rise to swallow the world. But his role in the unraveling of Odin's world was far more subtle and profound. He was a keeper of a secret, a quiet partner in a hidden pact. The Old Norse legends often personify natural phenomena, and the serpent is no different. A quirky detail is that he was not said to be evil, but simply a creature of cosmic balance. He was a force that maintained the separation between realms, kept the great oceans in their place, and his movements caused the tides and earthquakes. But he had a hidden purpose. He was a living conduit for a conversation that could not be spoken aloud. The pact was not between him and Loki, but between him and the lost eye. When Odin's eye, the very essence of his foresight, was given to Loki, it didn't just stay with the trickster. It was a tool, and a tool in the hands of the god of lies is a dangerous thing. Loki had a bizarre way of communicating with the serpent. He would cast a single thought into the ocean, and Jormungandr, as the guardian of the cosmic sea, would receive it and respond with a vibration that Loki could feel in his own being. It was a silent, secret language of lies and half-truths. The prophecy that was once contained in Mimir's well and was now being manipulated by Loki was being relayed, piece by piece, to Jormungandr. The serpent wasn't just waiting for Ragnarok. He was preparing for it. He was being fed information about the hero Odin was trying to manipulate, the one who was meant to fight him in the final battle. He was learning of this hero's weaknesses, his doubts, and his fears, all of which were being amplified by Loki and the god of quiet crafts. He was learning the best time to strike, not with brute force, but with psychological cunning. The historical fact is that in many cultures, the great serpent or dragon is not just a monster, but a symbol of cyclical time, of a natural force that resets the world when it becomes too corrupt. Jormungandr in this light wasn't the bringer of the end, but a cleanup crew for a world that had gone sour. But the question that remained was, what was the serpent's ultimate goal? He wasn't just a pawn in Loki's game. His interest was not in destruction, but in balance. He saw the psychological corruption that was eating away at the gods. He saw it as a sign that the time had come for a new world. He was using the information from Loki to ensure that the final battle would not be a glorious clash of heroes, but a necessary cleansing, a quiet end to a world that had lost its way. And as the silent communication continued, the serpent coiled ever tighter, not in preparation for a great attack, but in quiet anticipation of a new beginning. Valhalla, the great hall of fallen heroes, is the most celebrated destination in Norse mythology. A place of endless feasting, glorious battles, and the promise of eternal glory. It is here that Odin gathers his chosen warriors, the Einherjar, to prepare for the final battle of Ragnarok. The popular belief is that Valhalla is a paradise, a reward for courage and sacrifice. But what if it was never meant to be a paradise? What if it was something far darker, a place of psychological manipulation and quiet despair? The air inside Valhalla is not just filled with the clamor of celebration. You can feel a low, unsettling hum, a subtle tension that underpins every feast and every practiced skirmish. It's the sound of a purpose that is not what it seems. A quirky detail often overlooked is that the hall is said to be roofed with golden shields and spears, but its windows are actually the fangs of wolves. This suggests a place not of light and open revelry, but of watchful suspicion and a constant awareness of the lurking shadows. The heroes feast, they fight, they drink, but they are never truly at ease. They are being trained not for a great battle of glory, but for a war that has already begun, a war that is being fought in the minds of the gods. Odin's paranoia, fueled by the distorted information from Loki, had a direct impact on the purpose of Valhalla. He was no longer gathering the greatest heroes to fight a noble war. He was collecting them to be pawns in a twisted game of his own making. The great hero he saw in his vision was not one of the Einherjar, but a mortal warrior, a champion who was meant to be the linchpin of the final battle. But Loki's influence had convinced Odin that this hero would betray them, so the Allfather began to change the purpose of Valhalla. He was using the hall not to train an army, but to create a contingency plan, an alternate army, a force that could counter the hero he believed would one day turn on them. He was preparing not to face Ragnarok, but to face a phantom, a ghost of his own making. A historical fact that lends credence to this is the ancient practice of hero cults. In many cultures, heroes were venerated after death, but their purpose was not always to save the world. Sometimes, they were seen as a force to be appeased, a potential threat that needed to be kept in check. Valhalla, in this light, was less a glorious reward and more a gilded cage. Odin kept the heroes there, feasting and fighting so they would be under his watchful eye, so they would be ready to act on his command. A command that would inevitably be based on a lie. But the question that remained was, what would the heroes do when they realized the truth? What happens when you realize the eternal war you were preparing for is not against a noble foe, but against an innocent man who has been manipulated by the very gods you died to serve? The psychological weight of this would be immense. Valhalla was not a paradise, but a prison of false purpose. And as the silent war of the mind continued, the Great Hall, a symbol of Norse legends and glory, became a silent monument to Odin's quiet despair. Yggdrasil, the The world tree is the axis upon which the 9 realms of Norse cosmology are balanced. Its roots are deep, its branches stretch to the heavens, and its very being connects all things. It is the symbol of life, of cosmic order, and of the unending cycle of birth and death. The mainstream belief is that the tree is a constant, an unwavering presence. But what if the psychological rot that was eating away at the gods began to infect the very foundation of their reality? You can almost feel the air growing heavy, the scent of fresh leaves and ancient bark replaced by something sour and acrid. The low, mournful sound of the world tree's weeping is not the sound of water or sap, but a low groan, a psychic resonance of the growing discord in the universe. The tree felt the shift in Odin. It felt the paranoia, the doubt, the betrayal that was eating away at the Allfather's mind, and it reacted. A quirky detail of this is that the weeping was not just a sound. It was a visible change in the tree. A new kind of parasitic growth began to spread across its bark, a fungal bloom that looked like 1,000 tiny closed eyes. These weren't the eyes of wisdom, they were the eyes of suspicion, of silent judgment. This phenomenon has a parallel in a historical fact about ancient tree worship. In many cultures, sacred trees were seen as barometers of the spiritual health of a community. If a sacred tree withered or became sick, it was seen as a sign of spiritual corruption or a warning of a coming disaster. Yggdrasil's sickness was a cosmic warning. The tree was being infected by the same psychological plague that had taken root in Odin's mind. The roots that once drew wisdom from the wells of and Mimir were now drawing up a polluted current of doubt and despair. The branches that once bore the weight of the 9 realms were now beginning to crack under the strain of a lie. But the question that remained was, what was this parasitic growth? It wasn't just a physical ailment. It was a reflection of Odin's own mind. The tiny, closed eyes on the bark were the eyes of the Allfather. The 1,000 possibilities he had dismissed, the loyalties he had doubted, the truths he had buried. The tree was becoming a physical manifestation of his own psychological decay. The great hero that Odin had come to fear, the one he was now trying to manipulate, was also a victim of this plague. He was beginning to feel a strange psychic dissonance, a feeling that his own thoughts were not his own, that he was being watched, judged, and found wanting. The weeping of Yggdrasil was a sign that the lie was not just affecting the gods. It was affecting reality itself. The world was beginning to unravel, not with a bang, but with a silent, creeping sickness. The very laws of nature, the very cycles of life and death, were being warped by a single act of desperate self-preservation. And in the heart of this great weeping tree, the final countdown to Ragnarok was not being measured in battles and triumphs, but in the slow, agonizing sound of a world tree losing its mind. Odin's ravens, Hugin and Munin, are his eyes and ears in the world. Their names mean thought and memory, and they fly across the realms each day, returning to whisper the day's news into the Allfather's ear. This is one of the most well-known and beloved aspects of Norse mythology. The ravens are symbols of Odin's omnipotence, his ability to know all that transpires. But like all things, in a world corrupted by a lie, their purpose began to change. The silence that followed their return was the most unsettling sound of all. You can almost feel the absence of their whispers, a silent void where a torrent of information should be. Hugin thought, began to return with a strange, frantic energy. He would land on Odin's shoulder and, instead of whispering news, would simply stare at the Allfather with a frantic, unblinking gaze. He was seeing the psychological rot, the lies that were eating away at his master, and he had no words to describe it. He was filled with 1,000 frantic thoughts that could not be articulated, a mind filled with a chaos that had no language. Munin, memory, was worse. She would return to Odin's other shoulder and simply sit, motionless. She had not forgotten the past. But the present was becoming so incomprehensible that she could no longer add to her collection of memories. She was a being of a fixed reality, and the world she was observing was now a moving target, a constantly shifting landscape of half-truths and manufactured paranoia. She would look at Odin, and in her eyes you could see a profound, silent sorrow, the weight of a memory that was no longer a reliable anchor. This altered state of the ravens can be understood through a historical fact about the role of omens in ancient cultures. In many societies, the behavior of birds was seen as a sign from the gods, a way of communicating a coming good or ill. The silence of the ravens was the ultimate omen, a sign that the gods themselves had lost their way, that the very lines of communication had been severed. It was a sign that Odin was no longer receiving pure information, that his thoughts and memories were being compromised. The quirky detail here is that the ravens had a secret language, a series of clicks and coos that only the Allfather could understand. But now that language was filled with static, the low hum of the lie, and the ravens were physically unable to form the words. But the question that remained was, what was causing this? It was the lost eye. When Odin gave it to Loki, a feedback loop was created. The eye was a part of Odin, and the ravens were extensions of him. They were now being forced to observe the world through two separate lenses. Their own, which saw the truth, and the corrupted one, which was in Loki's possession. They were caught in a psychic conflict, a silent war between a reality they saw and a reality they were being forced to believe. And in this conflict, their very essence, their ability to think and to remember, was beginning to unravel. They were no longer the Allfather's eyes and ears. They were two silent, tormented creatures, watching their master and their world slowly descend into madness. The dwarves of Svartalfheim are masters of the forge, creators of the most magnificent artifacts in all the 9 realms. They are artisans of myth, their hands shaping not just metal and stone, but destiny itself. Mainstream mythology celebrates their creations, from Mjolnir, Thor's hammer, to the golden hair of Sif. But what if one of their most obscure creations, a strange and almost forgotten artifact, was the key to a truth that Odin had long since buried? The air in Svartalfheim is not just hot with the fire of the forges. You can feel a kind of nervous energy, a constant hum of creation and quiet paranoia. The dwarves in their isolated world were not blind to the changes in the upper realms. They felt the psychic tremors of the world tree. They heard the silent dissonance of the ravens, and they knew something was terribly wrong. A historical fact about ancient metallurgy is that some cultures believed that metals possessed a memory, that they could be imbued with the will and the history of their creator. The dwarves, in their own unique way, understood this. They knew that a tool was not just an object. It was a testament to the intent of the hands that shaped it. A quirky detail of a forgotten dwarf artifact is a small, shimmering disc made of a metal that doesn't exist anywhere else in the 9 realms. It was a mirror, but it did not reflect the world as it was. It reflected the world as it should be. The dwarves had created it as a tool for their own sanity, a way to remember the truth of the world when they felt the gods above them were slowly losing their minds. This mirror was a secret they kept even from Odin, because they knew that in his paranoia, he would either try to destroy it or possess it, and either way, the truth would be lost. But the question that remained was, what would happen if this mirror fell into the wrong hands? What if a god who was not a part of the madness, a god who was not compromised by Loki's lies, were to look into it? The mirror had the power to show a different path, a future that could have been a world where Odin had not made that terrible pact with Mimir, where the eye had not been lost, where the hero had not been manipulated, and where the gods were not eating themselves from the inside out. It was a vision of a world that was still whole, and a god was about to find it. It's not a god of war or of thunder, but a goddess of light and of truth. A being who, in her gentle way, had been growing increasingly suspicious of the growing darkness. This goddess would stumble upon the secret of the mirror, and in doing so, she would see the lie for what it was. She would see not just the truth of Odin's pact, but the truth of the psychological rot that was eating away at the very fabric of their reality. The mirror was not just an artifact. It was a key. It was a key to a forgotten realm of possibility, a realm where truth still had a chance. And in the silent, anxious atmosphere of the dwarf forges, the stage was being set for a confrontation that would not be one of brute strength, but of a quiet and terrifying revelation. The Vanir, a separate tribe of gods from the Aesir, represent a different kind of power. They are the deities of fertility, of wisdom, and of a subtle, deep magic that is in harmony with the natural world. Mainstream mythology often portrays their ancient war with the Aesir as a great bloody conflict that ended in a stalemate and a fragile peace. But that peace was never truly stable. It was a truce born of necessity, and it was about to be broken by a lie that had nothing to do with them, and everything to do with the Allfather. The air in Vanaheim, the Vanir's realm, is not just serene. You can feel a quiet tension, a sense of a people who are watching from the sidelines, waiting for the inevitable. The Vanir had a different relationship with truth. A historical fact about ancient Germanic tribes is that they often had two types of spiritual leaders: the warrior priests who dealt with the gods of war, and the shamanic figures who dealt with the gods of nature and foresight. The Vanir were the latter. They were not easily fooled by displays of power or grand pronouncements. They saw the deeper currents of the cosmos. A quirky detail of their lore is that they had a secret way of communicating across realms, not through words, but through the growth of certain plants. A flower that bloomed in Vanaheim could mirror the bloom of a single, fragile truth in Asgard. The Vanir were the first to notice the sickness of Yggdrasil. They felt the psychic dissonance, the subtle unraveling of reality, and they began to worry. Their own delicate magic, their connection to the natural world, was being polluted by the lie that Odin was so desperately clinging to. They saw the corruption of the Allfather's mind, and they saw that it was having a direct impact on the very essence of their world. But they did not blame Odin. They blamed the source of his corruption, Loki. But the question that remained was, what would they do about it? They were not a people of war. They would not charge into Asgard with swords drawn. They had to use their own unique form of power. They began to forge a pact, not with the Aesir, but with a third party. They reached out to the dwarves, who, in their own way, had been watching and waiting. They knew of the mirror, the one that showed the truth, and they knew that the Vanir, in their wisdom, were the only ones who could be trusted with such a dangerous artifact. The pact was simple. The dwarves would provide the mirror to the Vanir, and in return, the Vanir would help the dwarves protect their own realm from the encroaching chaos. It was a fragile alliance, a temporary truce between two disparate peoples united by a common fear. They were not trying to save the Aesir. They were trying to save the world. They saw that Odin, in his madness, was a lost cause. The only way to stop the psychological war was to reveal the truth, not to the Allfather, but to the great hero. He had come to fear the one whose destiny was inextricably linked to the end of all things. Vanya, with their subtle magic and their quiet wisdom, were about to play a hand in a game they never wanted to be a part of, a hand that would change the course of destiny forever. Loki, the god of lies, is not a simple villain. He is a master of psychological intrigue, a chaotic force who thrives on the unraveling of order. Mainstream Norse legends paint him as a troublemaker, a trickster who causes mischief for the sheer joy of it. But his actions after gaining Odin's eye were not mischief. They were the precise, methodical work of a seeker of lies. He was on a mission to not just create falsehoods, but to find and exploit the hidden lies that already existed in the cosmos. You can almost hear the low, insidious whisper that follows Loki everywhere, a rustle of unspoken truths and buried secrets. The quirky detail about Loki is that he had a unique form of magic that was not about illusions or fire, but about finding the most vulnerable and fundamental lies in a person or a system and using them as a weapon. He didn't just twist the truth. He found the raw material of lies, the self-deceptions, and the fears that people held dear, and he used them against them. He was a god of psychological excavation. This is a concept that has parallels in a historical fact about ancient spies and double agents. They were not just about gathering information. They were about finding the psychological vulnerabilities of their targets and using them to turn a person against their own people. Loki, using Odin's lost eye, was doing this on a cosmic scale. He saw the great hero that Odin had come to fear, a warrior of immense strength and courage. But he also saw the hero's secret, a single, crippling doubt that he held in his heart. It was a lie, he told himself, a belief that he was not worthy of the trust placed in him. Loki didn't create this lie, found it, and then, using the power of the eye, he began to amplify it, to show Odin a distorted version of the hero's doubt. He would show Odin the hero's moments of quiet reflection and translate them as moments of treason. He would show the hero's simple questions and make them sound like challenges to Odin's authority. But the question that remained was, what was Loki's ultimate goal? It wasn't just to see Odin suffer. Loki's mission was to prove a point. He believed that the gods, in their self-righteousness, were built on a foundation of lies. They told themselves they were just, they were brave, they were honest. Loki was on a quest to expose these self-deceptions. He was using Odin's paranoia as a tool to prove that the gods were just as fallible, just as corruptible as the mortals they ruled over. He was a god of chaos, yes, but it was a chaos that had a terrible, almost philosophical purpose. He was the great deconstructionist, and he was using the very foresight of the Allfather to tear down the entire system from the inside out. And as he continued his quiet, methodical work, the psychological plague he was spreading began to take a different form. It was no longer just about Odin's paranoia, it was about the entire world's belief in the gods themselves. He was showing a world of mortals and immortals alike, that their heroes were flawed, that their gods were hypocrites, and that the promise of Ragnarok was not a grand, glorious end, but a quiet, pathetic unraveling. And in that, he was succeeding more than any giant or monster ever could. The constellations of the night sky are not just a collection of stars. For the Norse, they were a cosmic map, a way to read the future and to remember the ancient past. Mainstream mythology often speaks of the stars as fixed points of light, a reliable anchor in the ever-shifting heavens. But a world in the grip of a psychological lie cannot maintain a fixed reality, and so the stars began to fade, and the constellations began to shift, revealing a new and ominous pattern. You can feel a cold dread creeping in as you look up at the night sky. The familiar shapes, the Great Bear, the Hunter are no longer where they should be. The very fabric of the cosmos seems to be stretching, thinning, as if a great weight were being placed upon it. A historical fact about ancient astronomy is that many cultures believed that the positions of the stars had a direct impact on the fates of kings and nations. When a new star appeared, it was seen as an omen of a new ruler or a coming catastrophe. When a star faded, it was a sign of a king's waning power or a kingdom's decline. This is what was happening in the Norse cosmos. The power of Odin and his faith in himself was fading, and the stars were reflecting that truth. The quirky detail here is that the new constellations that were appearing were not of heroes or gods, but of a different kind of being. They were forming the shapes of the giants, the monsters, and the unseen forces of chaos. The stars were not just moving. They were telling a new story, a story that was not about the glory of the gods, but about the coming triumph of their enemies. It was the universe itself, the very cosmic order, reacting to the lie that Odin was living. The psychological plague that was eating away at the Allfather's mind was having a physical, cosmic manifestation. The more he doubted his loyal heroes, the more he trusted his duplicitous confidants. The more the stars shifted, each one a silent judgment, a celestial reminder of the path he had chosen. But the question that remained was, what was the connection between a god's mind and the stars? The answer lies in the nature of the lost eye. When Odin's eye, the orb of ambition and foresight, was given to Loki, it became a tool that could not only see the future, but could also influence it. Loki was not just showing Odin a lie. He was using the eye's power to make that lie a reality. He was, in effect, rewriting the cosmic script, and the stars were the ink. He was using Odin's own power against him, using a piece of the Allfather's soul to turn the universe into a funhouse mirror of his own paranoid mind. The fading of the stars was a sign that the gods' control over their world was slipping. Cosmos was no longer a stage for their glorious sagas. It was becoming a playground for a god of chaos and a silent, ancient enemy. And as the constellations shifted, a new, ominous pattern began to emerge. A pattern that foretold not a glorious war, but a final, silent surrender of the universe to the inevitable. Fenrir, the great wolf, is one of the most terrifying figures in Norse mythology. He is the son of Loki, and it is prophesied that he will one day break his bonds and devour Odin himself during Ragnarok. The mainstream belief is that he was bound by a magical chain forged by the dwarves, a chain that was as light as a ribbon but as strong as a mountain. But what if the true chains that bound him were not of iron, but of a far more sinister magic? The air around Fenrir's lair is thick with a sense of immense coiled power, a latent potential for destruction that is just waiting to be unleashed. The chains that hold him, Gleipnir, were forged not from metal, but from the most bizarre of ingredients: the sound of a cat's footfall, the beard of a woman, the roots of a mountain, the sinews of a bear, the breath of a fish, and the spittle of a bird. This quirky detail, often seen as a fun bit of mythological poetry, is a clue to the true nature of his imprisonment. The chains were not physical, they were metaphysical. They were a web of lies, a series of impossible truths that held the wolf in place. A historical fact about the use of trolls or charms in ancient folklore is that they were often based on a clever use of paradox. A charm to keep a monster away might be a list of impossible things, a way of confusing a being who operates on raw power and a single predictable logic. Fenrir's chains were just that, a series of impossibilities that kept him in a state of suspended reality. But what if the very things that bound him were also the things that were keeping him in a state of eternal rage? What if the lies that held him were also a constant source of agony? But the question that remained was, what was Fenrir's true role in Loki's plan? He wasn't just a weapon to be unleashed. He was a symbol. Loki, using the power of Odin's lost eye, had a different plan for the wolf. He was not just waiting for Fenrir to break free. He was actively cultivating the wolf's rage, feeding it with the very lies that were eating away at the gods. The lies were not just holding the wolf. They were poisoning him, making him a perfect weapon for the end of days. Loki was showing the wolf a twisted vision of a world where he was unjustly imprisoned, where the gods were hypocrites, and where Odin, the supposed Allfather, was a coward who feared a simple wolf more than he feared the truth. Fenrir's imprisonment in this light was not just about protecting the gods. It was about ensuring that when he did break free, he would be filled with a righteous, unyielding fury. The chains that bound him were not about keeping him in. They were about keeping the lie in. Loki was not just a god of lies. He was a master of psychological warfare. He was using his own son as a kind of emotional battery, charging him with a rage so pure and so perfect that when it was finally unleashed, it would not just destroy Odin, but it would shatter the very foundations of the world. And in his quiet, icy lair, the great wolf continued to wait, his heart a ticking bomb of rage, and a burning hatred for the father who had lied to him. The myth of Odin's sacrifice is often told as a story of a single heroic act. He gave up an eye for wisdom, and that was the end of it. But what if the story was far more complex? What if the eye he gave away was not just a tool for sight, but one half of a divine pair? The Allfather's remaining eye was the one that saw what was, the eye of the present of power and dominion. The one he lost was the eye of possibility, the eye that saw what could be. But the two were not separate. They were a twin. And in giving one away, Odin created a void, a phantom limb of vision that was just as dangerous as the sight he had lost. The air around Odin is not just heavy with his kingly presence. You can feel the absence, the psychic scar of the missing eye. It's a wound that never healed, a constant reminder of the bargain he made. A quirky detail of this is that the two eyes had a secret, symbiotic relationship. The left eye, the one of the present, could only see what was real and tangible. The right eye, the one of the future, could only see what was possible. When they worked together, they gave Odin a perfect, complete understanding of the world and his place in it. When he gave one away, his remaining eye became useless in a different way. It could only see the present, but it could no longer understand its own context. It saw facts without meaning, actions without consequences. It was a kind of blindness in plain sight. This is a concept that has parallels in a historical fact about the human brain. The two hemispheres of the brain, while they can function independently, are far more powerful when they communicate. When one is damaged, the other's perception can become skewed. Odin's remaining eye was like a brain hemisphere that had lost its other half. It was trying to make sense of a world that was now a series of disconnected events. The information that Loki was feeding him through the lost eye wasn't just a lie. It was the missing half of a truth that Odin could no longer see. Loki was using the lost twin to give Odin a terrible, distorted sense of purpose, a mission to stop a ghost, to fight a lie. But the question that remained was, Where was the lost twin of his eye? It wasn't just a physical artifact. It was an extension of his will. It had a life of its own, a kind of psychic autonomy, and it had found a new twin. It was a strange, silent connection, a kind of resonance between two beings who were not supposed to be connected. The lost eye, now in Loki's possession, was beginning to resonate with the heart of the great hero Odin had come to fear. The hero, in his strength and his goodness, was beginning to feel a strange, almost physical ache in his own soul, a feeling that he was being watched, that he was being pulled in a direction he did not want to go. He was unknowingly becoming a new kind of twin, a new kind of purpose for the lost eye. And in the heart of this hero, the fate of the cosmos was being decided not with a clash of swords, but with a quiet internal war between a god's will and a man's soul. The frost giants of Jotunheim are not just brute forces of nature. They are beings of immense, chilling, cunning, and their most dangerous weapon is not their strength, but their ability to manipulate the subconscious mind. For them, a war is not won on the battlefield, but in the dreams of their enemies. And in the wake of Odin's psychological decline, they began to have a shared nightmare. A blueprint for the end of days that was being broadcast across the cosmos. You can almost feel the cold seeping into the air, a kind of psychic chill that precedes a terrible prophecy. The giants' dreams were not filled with fire and ice, but with a quiet, insidious terror. They saw a vision of a world where the gods turned on each other, where loyalty was a weakness, and where a single, innocent hero was driven to madness by a lie. A quirky detail of this is that the dreams were not of their own making. They were echoes of the psychological war that Loki was waging against Odin, the giants. In their ancient, primal way, were able to tap into the cosmic currents of fear and paranoia that were being broadcast by the lost eye. They were seeing the coming of Ragnarok, not as a glorious end, but as a slow, pathetic, and almost silent unraveling. This has a strange parallel to a historical fact about some ancient shamanic cultures. They believed that they could enter the dreams of their enemies and plant seeds of doubt and fear. The frost giants were doing this on a cosmic scale. They were not just seeing a prophecy. They were absorbing it, and then in a strange, silent way, they were broadcasting it back to the gods. They were making the gods' own worst fears a reality. They were a collective unconscious, a great dark mirror that was reflecting back the lies that the gods had told themselves. But the question that remained was, what would the giants do with this knowledge? They were not just observers. They were participants. They were not trying to create Ragnarok. They were trying to shape it. They wanted to ensure that when the final battle came, it would not be a glorious triumph for the gods, but a quiet, almost embarrassing end. They wanted to see the gods brought low, not by a mighty army, but by their own hubris and their own self-deceptions. They wanted to win not through strength, but through a kind of quiet, psychological surrender. The shared nightmare of the frost giants was a sign that the end was no longer a distant possibility. It was a looming psychological certainty. The more Odin succumbed to his paranoia, the more the great hero was driven to doubt himself. The more the dreams of the giants began to align to form a clear and terrible blueprint. And in the icy heart of Jotunheim, the giants began to smile, not with glee, but with a kind of quiet, ancient satisfaction. They knew that the end of the world would not be won with a bang, but with the quiet, chilling sound of a god losing his mind. The Valkyries, Odin's chosen women warriors, are the most celebrated figures in Norse lore. They are the choosers of the slain, the fierce and beautiful maidens who guide the souls of fallen heroes to Valhalla. Mainstream mythology paints them as unwavering in their loyalty to the Allfather, symbol of divine purpose and a reward for courage. But what happens when a Valkyrie, a being of pure will and noble purpose, begins to see the rot at the heart of their master's kingdom? You can almost feel the air in Valhalla growing cold, the celebratory roar of the feasting hall replaced by a low, unsettling hum of doubt. One of the Valkyries, a particularly perceptive and ancient one, had begun to see a disturbing pattern. A quirky detail of her character was that her spear was not made of metal, but of a kind of crystallized moonlight, and it did not just wound her enemies, it could also pierce through illusions. It was a tool of a different kind of war, a war against deceit. A historical fact about ancient female warrior cults is that they were often seen not just as soldiers, but as spiritual guides, protectors of truth and order. The Valkyries were no different. Their purpose was not just to gather heroes, but to ensure that the heroes they gathered were worthy, that their deaths had meaning. But the meaning of their deaths was becoming unclear. The Valkyrie began to feel a strange psychic dissonance every time she brought a new hero to Valhalla. The heroes' souls were not whole. They were filled with a kind of quiet, almost undetectable despair, a feeling that their sacrifice had been for nothing. She would ask Odin about it, and he would dismiss her fears as a weakness, a lack of faith. He would tell her that she was not seeing the grand strategic plan, that the ends justified the means. But the Valkyrie could not shake the feeling that the ends were not glorious, but pathetic. She saw the hero that Odin was so paranoid about, a mortal man who was not a traitor but a victim. She saw him not with suspicion, but with a growing sense of pity. But the question that remained was, what would she do about it? She was sworn to Odin, bound by a sacred oath. She could not just betray him. She was caught in a terrible dilemma. To continue her duty was to participate in a lie, to bring worthy souls to a prison of false purpose. To disobey him was to break her sacred vow and to risk the wrath of the Allfather. She had to choose between her loyalty to her master and her loyalty to the truth. She had to decide whether the glory of Valhalla was more important than the integrity of a single soul. And in that moment of quiet, internal struggle, she made a choice. She would continue her duty, but she would change her purpose. She would no longer just be a chooser of the slain. She would become a guardian of the truth. She would use her spear of crystallized moonlight to find the lie that was eating away at the world, to find the source of the corruption, and to reveal it to the only person who could do anything about it, the great hero himself. She was about to go from being an instrument of Odin's will to an instrument of his undoing. And in her quiet, deliberate choice, the fate of the cosmos was about to be turned on its head. Bifrost, the rainbow bridge that connects Midgard to Asgard, is one of the most iconic images in Norse mythology. It is a symbol of hope, a beautiful and vibrant testament to the link between the mortal and immortal worlds. Mainstream mythology says it is guarded by the god Heimdall, who stands ever vigilant, ready to sound the Jallarhorn at the first sign of an attack. But what if the bridge was not just a symbol of hope, but a trap? What if its true purpose was not to protect Asgard, but to keep a secret? You can almost feel the air on the bridge, a low, thrumming energy that is less like a rainbow and more like a high-tension wire. The colors are too vibrant, almost unnaturally so, as if they are a mask for something far more sinister. A historical fact about ancient bridge building is that they were not just a way to get from one place to another. They were often seen as a threshold, a place where the laws of reality could be bent, a place where a person could be judged or transformed. Bifrost, in this light, was a kind of cosmic toll road, a place where a person's worthiness was weighed. A quirky detail of the bridge is that it is said to be made of fire, and that only the gods can cross it without being burned. This suggests a kind of metaphysical judgment, a way of keeping out anyone who is not pure of heart. What if the fire was not a protection against an enemy, but a way to erase a memory? What if the true purpose of the bridge was not to keep out the giants, but to keep out the truth? Heimdall, the guardian of the bridge, had a strange, almost unsettling role in this. His horn was not just meant to announce the coming of Ragnarok. It was also meant to sound a kind of psychic alarm, a way of warning the gods that a great lie had been found. But the horn had been silent for a long time. The question that remained was, why was it silent? Heimdall was the most vigilant of all the gods. He could hear the sound of grass growing and the wool on a sheep's back. So why could he not hear the great lie that was eating away at his master? The answer lies in the psychological plague that Odin was broadcasting. The more the Allfather succumbed to his paranoia, the more he subconsciously began to believe that the bridge was not just a passage, but a kind of cosmic lie detector. He began to project his own fear of the truth onto the bridge, and in doing so, he made it a place where truth could not exist. Heimdall, in his perfect vigilance, was not just guarding the bridge from an external foe. He was guarding it from a truth that was coming from within. He was an instrument of Odin's delusion, a protector of a lie. And as the great hero, the one whom the Valkyrie was trying to reach, approached the bridge, he felt a strange, almost physical repulsion. He could not cross it. It was not because he was a traitor, but because his heart was filled with a growing sense of a terrible truth. And the bridge, in its perverted state, would not allow him to pass. He was being kept from Asgard not by an enemy, but by the very gods he was meant to save. The Rainbow Bridge, a symbol of hope and unity, had become the final barrier to the truth. And in that moment, the fate of the cosmos was sealed, not with a clash of swords, but with the quiet, chilling reality of an illusion that had become too powerful to be broken. The Norns, the three sisters who weave the threads of fate, are the most enigmatic and powerful figures in Norse mythology. They sit at the base of Yggdrasil, drawing water from the well of and shaping the destiny of all beings, mortal and immortal alike. Mainstream mythology portrays them as impartial, quiet figures, weavers of a predetermined cosmic tapestry. But what if they were not just weavers, but also a kind of cosmic historian? And what if the story they were weaving was being unraveled, thread by a single desperate lie? You can almost feel the air around the well, profound and silent energy that hums with the weight of all that has been and all that will be. The sound of their loom is not a gentle click-clack, but a deep, resonating hum, a sound that is both comforting and terrifying. A historical fact about weaving in ancient cultures is that it was often seen as a spiritual practice, a way of connecting with the divine. The loom was a metaphor for the universe, and the weaver was a metaphor for the creator. The Norns, in this light, were not just weavers. They were living records of the universe's history. A quirky detail of their lore is that the threads they wove were not just a single color. They were a shimmering, iridescent blend of all the possibilities that a person could be. But the threads were beginning to fray. The psychic dissonance that was radiating from Odin, the lie that was eating away at the very fabric of reality, was having a direct and terrible impact on the Norns' work. The threads of fate that they were weaving were no longer a perfect, shimmering tapestry. They were becoming a tangled mess of contradictions and half-truths. The threads of the great hero's destiny, which should have been a bright golden line, were now a dark and tangled knot, filled with the knots of fear and paranoia that Loki had placed there. The Norns could feel the corruption, the lie that was radiating from Odin's lost eye. And in a strange, silent way, they were communicating with the one person who could understand them, the Valkyrie with the spear of moonlight. But the question that remained was, what would the Norns do about it? They were not supposed to interfere. Their purpose was to observe and to weave. They were not supposed to change the story. But the story was changing itself, and for the worse. They had to make a choice, to continue to weave a tapestry of lies, or to find a way to make the truth known. They chose the latter. In a quiet, almost imperceptible act, they began to unravel a single thread from the tapestry. A thread that was not of a person's destiny, but of the lie itself. They wove this thread into the moonlight spear of the Valkyrie, imbuing it with the truth of the cosmos. With the history of the lie that had corrupted Odin, they gave her a tool not just to see the truth, but to reveal it. And so, the stage was set for the final confrontation. Not a battle of swords and shields, but a battle of truth and lies. A Valkyrie armed with the truth from the very fabric of fate was about to go to the great hero, the man who was being driven mad by a lie, and she was about to show him a different path. The Norns, in their quiet way, had just intervened in the fate of the cosmos, and in doing so, they had set in motion a chain of events that would lead not to the end of the world, but to a different kind of beginning. Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods, is the most climactic and well-known event in Norse mythology. It is a story of a final, glorious battle between the forces of order and the forces of chaos. A cosmic conflict that will end with the death of the gods and the birth of a new world. Mainstream belief is that this will be a grand and bloody affair, a final, epic showdown. But what if the echoes of Ragnarok were not of a final battle, but of a different, more insidious end? What if the end of the world was not a great conflagration, but a quiet surrender? You can almost feel the air growing still, the silence that precedes a storm, not of thunder and lightning, but of a quiet, psychological surrender. The echoes of Ragnarok that the cosmos was beginning to feel were not of clashing swords and roaring beasts. They were the sound of doubt, of fear, of a god losing his mind. A quirky detail of this is that the word Ragnar can also be translated as the destiny of the gods. This suggests that the end was not just a battle, but a predetermined outcome, a final act in a play that had already been written. But what if the play was being rewritten, not by a god of lies, but by the very lies themselves? A historical fact that lends credence to this is the ancient practice of psychological warfare. In many cultures, the goal was not to destroy an enemy's army, but to destroy their will to fight. The end of the world that was beginning to take shape was not about brute force. It was about the slow, agonizing psychological collapse of the gods. The great hero, the one who was meant to be the linchpin of the final battle, was being driven to a quiet internal despair. The gods, in their paranoia, were turning on each other, creating a world where no one could be trusted, where loyalty was a liability. The end of the world was not going to be a glorious, bloody fight. It was going to be a quiet surrender, a world that was so hollowed out by lies that it simply ceased to exist. But the question that remained was, what would happen to the world that was left behind? What happens when a world dies, not with a bang, but with a whimper? The answer is more chilling than any monster or giant. A world that ends in a quiet psychological collapse is a world that has no need for a new beginning. A world that has lost its meaning has no need for a new purpose. The new world that was prophesied to rise from the ashes of Ragnarok was not going to be a world of heroes and gods, but a world of quiet, pathetic, and meaningless existence. It was going to be a world that was devoid of purpose, a world that was ruled not by gods, but by the memory of a single, terrible lie. The echoes of Ragnarok were a silent judgment, a final warning that the end of the world was not a glorious final battle, but a quiet psychological surrender. The gods, in their desperation to avoid their fate, had created a more terrible fate for themselves. A world that was not worth saving, a world that would simply cease to be, not with fire and ice, but with a silent and terrible whimper. The greatest fear of the gods is not death, but a far more profound loss. They are immortal, yes, but their existence is bound to a single truth: their purpose. They exist to protect the world, to fight for order, and to be the heroes of a great saga. Mainstream mythology often focuses on their physical power, their strength in battle, their immortality. But what if their greatest weakness was not a physical one at all, but a spiritual one? You can feel a kind of cold despair seeping into the very essence of the gods. They are not just losing their power, they are losing their purpose. The psychological plague that was eating away at Odin was beginning to spread to the other gods, a silent, insidious disease. They began to question their own worth, their own purpose. They were not fighting a glorious battle. They were fighting against a lie, and the lie was winning. A quirky detail of this is that the gods' immortality was not just about living forever. It was about the stories that would be told about them forever. The gods were living narratives, and the narratives were beginning to rot from the inside out. This has a powerful parallel in a historical fact about the hero's journey in ancient storytelling. The hero's journey is a narrative arc that has been used in countless stories across all cultures. The hero faces a great challenge. He is transformed by it, and he returns to his people a better and wiser person. But what if the hero's journey was being corrupted? What if the hero was not being transformed, but perverted? The gods were not just losing their lives, they were losing their stories. They were losing the very reason for their existence. The great deeds they had done, the glorious battles they had fought, were beginning to feel meaningless, a part of a larger lie. But the question that remained was, what was a god without a purpose, without a story? The answer is more terrifying than any monster. A god without a purpose is not a god at all. They are a kind of cosmic ghost, a silent, pathetic being who exists in a state of eternal meaninglessness. The end of the world that was taking shape was not about the death of the gods. It was about their spiritual annihilation. It was about them becoming a hollowed-out version of their former selves. The gods, in their desperate attempt to avert a physical death, had created a far more terrible fate for themselves. A kind of quiet spiritual death, a death of a million silent cuts, a death that would leave them in a state of eternal meaningless existence. And in that, they were achieving what no enemy, no giant, no monster ever could. They were destroying themselves, not with a bang, but with the quiet, chilling sound of a god losing his purpose. They were becoming a monument to a single, terrible lie. In the quiet, chilling reality of a world unraveling, Odin, the Allfather, began to see the truth. Not through his remaining eye, which was now a useless tool of a twisted perception, but through a different kind of sight. It was a terrible, agonizing clarity that came not from a well of wisdom, but from the depths of his own despair. He saw the psychological rot he had created, the paranoia he had embraced, and the innocent hero he had driven to the brink of madness. He saw the world he had fought so hard to save, and he saw that it was not just dying, but being hollowed out by a single, terrible lie. He had to make a final sacrifice, not to gain wisdom, but to atone for his folly. The final act of Odin was not a glorious charge into battle, it was a quiet, desperate act of redemption. A quirky detail of this is that he did not use his spear, Gungnir, a symbol of his power and his authority. He used a different tool, a small, almost forgotten knife that he had made himself. It was not a weapon of war, but a tool of a different kind of sacrifice, a tool to sever a connection. A historical fact about ancient sacrifices is that they were not always about death. Sometimes they were about a severing of a bond, a way to break a connection that had become toxic. Odin was about to sever his connection to the lost eye. He was about to do the one thing he had not done at Mimir Swell. He was about to surrender. He had to make a final choice. To continue to fight a war he could not win, or to accept his fate and try to save a single soul. He chose the latter. He found the great hero, the one who was now a broken and tormented man, and he did not come to him as a king, but as a father. He did not come to him with a grand strategic plan, but with a quiet, heartbreaking confession. He told him the truth, not about the future, but about the past. He told him about the well, about the pact, and about the lie that had corrupted everything. He told him that he, the Allfather, had been a fool, that the hero's pain was not his own fault, but a byproduct of a god's desperate fear. But the question that remained was, what would happen next? What happens when a hero realizes that the god he served, the god he died to protect, was the very source of his own torment? What happens when a god, the Allfather himself, surrenders his pride and confesses his folly? The answer is both tragic and beautiful. The hero, in his quiet despair, had to make a choice. He could continue to be a victim, to be a pawn in a game he never wanted to play. Or he could find a new purpose, a new reason to exist. Odin had given him the one thing that could save him: the truth. The final sacrifice was not just the severing of a connection. It was the offering of a new path. It was a silent and terrifyingly honest act of love. And in that quiet, desperate moment, the fate of the cosmos was decided, not with a battle of gods and monsters, but with a silent and terrible surrender of a god's pride. The final, chilling reveal was not in a prophecy, but in a memory. It was at the very bottom of Mimir's well, in the place where the cosmic memories reside. Odin had gone there to bury a truth that was so terrifying he could not bear to know it. He had not sacrificed his eye for wisdom. He had sacrificed it to forget. He had seen a vision of a quiet, insidious end, not a glorious battle, but a slow, pathetic, and meaningless decay. He had seen the gods turning on each other, the heroes losing their purpose, and the cosmos unraveling. Not because of a monster or a giant, but because of a single terrible lie. He had seen the truth of Ragnarok, and it was not a grand final battle, but a quiet, psychological surrender. He was not afraid of death. He was afraid of meaninglessness. The wind down starts here. It's the story, the one you have just heard, is not about the end of the world. It is about the price of knowledge, the cost of a single, terrible lie. It is about the most human of flaws, the desperate need to avert a fate that we are too afraid to face. The gods, for all their power and their glory, were not so different from us. They were afraid of what they did not know. They were afraid of what they could not control, and in that fear, they made a choice that would doom them all. The truth was not in a prophecy or a hero's journey. It was at the bottom of a well, a silent, chilling truth that a god had to sacrifice his own sight to forget. Remember the first moment, the first whisper of the lie. Remember the low, unending hum of Gungnir, the whispers that were a lie wrapped in the thinnest veneer of truth. Remember the silence of the ravens, the slow, pathetic decay of the world tree, the fading stars, and the quiet despair of the gods. The end was not a glorious final battle. It was a quiet psychological surrender, a world that was so hollowed out by lies that it simply ceased to exist. Now, take a deep breath. The story is over, the tension has faded. The gods have made their choice, and the world has accepted its fate. Close your eyes and imagine a new world, a world where the truth has a chance to be heard, a world where the heroes have a new purpose, a world that is not a monument to a single terrible lie. Out. Let the sound of the ocean, the gentle lapping of the water on the shore, and the quiet whisper of the wind be a comfort to you. The story is over, but the myth, the legend, the quiet, terrifying truth, it will live on. It is in the whispers of the wind, in the sound of the waves, and in the quiet of the night. It is a story that you will never forget. It is the story of a god who lost his eye, and in doing so, found the most terrifying of all truths.